I'm going to say we made this terrible mistake in marketing, which is, if I've got one tip for anybody who's a marketer, very, very simple, okay? We've made this terrible mistake because we've been taught that we're subordinate to the finance department and that every penny we spend has to be justified by an immediate penny of incremental revenue, okay? And my argument, very simply, is that that's done us a massive disservice. We would have been much, much happier if there'd never been a department called marketing. Because marketing isn't a department, it's a way of looking at the world. Pure and simple. It's a way of looking at the world through the point of view of looking at the world through the eyes of your both present and potential customers, and then working out, usually with a degree of the imagination, what might create incremental value in the relationship between the two of you. And the tragedy I think we've had is that people think of marketing as effectively the current department. I had a friend who was the marketing director of Direct Line, and he was sent someone on secondment from like the actuarial nerds department of Direct Line, who actually said, I don't know why they've seconded me to marketing because I'm rubbish at drawing. Okay, and we've got to be alert to the fact that because unfortunately there's a department called marketing, what we've decided to do is we've allowed people to define marketing as those things which are done by people in the marketing department, usually using some sort of comms budget or marcoms budget. That's about 10% of the value of marketing. And so we've hugely allowed ourselves to be massively devalued. And if I've done anything of value, I think, for marketers, it's simply to point out that marketing is much, much bigger and more important. By the way, if anybody standing at the back wants to go and grab a seat, I think there's some just over there. It's much, much, much bigger than anybody realizes, because the greater part of marketing, which has huge economic effects, isn't necessarily the product of intentional activity by people in the marketing department. And I define marketing, first of all, as a form of innovation. And I make no apology for this. R&D and marketing are exactly the same thing. Okay? They should be treated as exactly the same thing in budgetary terms. They should be treated in exactly the same way in terms of how they're evaluated, because they're both fat-tailed activities where 10% of what you do probably delivers 120% of the value. So judging marketing unit by unit at a granular level is to completely undervalue marketing. Because the main value of marketing actually isn't that you incrementally improve things by 5.6% annually. The main value of marketing is that every now and then you have a complete breakthrough which changes the rules of the game. Now, why are marketing and R&D and innovation the same thing? Very simple. There are two ways you can actually make more money in the marketplace. You can either find out what people want and work out a really clever way to make it, or you can find out what you can make and work out a really clever way to make people want it. And the money you make is indistinguishable either way. It doesn't matter what the direction of travel is. I would argue that Steve Jobs was predominantly a marketer. I'd argue that Thomas Edison was predominantly a marketer. And to a large extent, although he was a brilliant inventor, James Watt was a brilliant marketer. You may have heard me tell this story before, apologies for that. When James Watt and Matthew Boulton were selling early steam engines to mine owners, the use case for mine owners for steam engines was that they drained the mines. And they were having trouble selling these steam engines. And eventually, Watt and Boulton said, we've been talking about, calorific, they're engineers, we've been talking about calorific capacity, boiler size, piston stroke length. We're not selling any steam engines. What do these people want to know? And somebody said, what they want to know is how many horses they can get rid of if they buy a steam engine. Because at the time you were using and feeding and taking care of horses which walked around in a huge circle to drain the mines. That was your source of motive power. And so Watt and Boulton go off and invent a unit of power we still use today, which is the horsepower. Because they suddenly realize if you say, that's a 25 horsepower steam engine, if you buy one of those, you can get rid of 75 horses, because the horses worked in 3 shifts, presumably. Suddenly, it was pretty easy to sell the steam engines. I then went to research this and discovered they were actually cleverer still, because there was another target audience who were already draining their mines with steam power, but they were using the less efficient Newcomen engine rather than the Watt engine. And fascinatingly, What they did is they did hardware as a service. They didn't sell those people a steam engine. They said, if you prepare, a nice little shed for us to put them, we'll provide you with the steam engines for free. And what we want you to pay us is 1/3 of the money you save on coal. So long before Rolls-Royce started charging for jet engines by hours in use, Watt and Bolton were effectively saying, we'll replace your Newcomen engine for free, but you're going to use about 1/3 of the quantity of coal, and the money you're saving, basically, I think we want is either half or 1/3 of it. Very clever alignment of, that was Amazon Prime for 1776, a really ingenious pricing model, absolutely brilliant. What had the result, by the way, quite neatly, is it tended to explain why lots and lots of these steam engines were first installed in Cornwall, because in Cornwall, being a long way from a decent coal field, coal was much more expensive. So their interests were also aligned with the interests of their customers. And so generally, if you delve back enough, when you find a great innovation case study, there's usually a great marketing case study alongside it. The techies in Apple didn't like Steve Jobs, okay? They said, I don't get what Steve even does, like he can't even code, okay? Now, the other reason why marketing and innovation, I think, are intimately connected is because what something is to a consumer is not a feature of what it is, it's a feature of what they were expecting it to be. So I'm a big fan. Anybody a fan of Moxie Hotels here? Okay, yeah. Brilliant, sort of very small room, very good location, small room, no laundry, no room service, very good Wi-Fi. The ground floor's like a kind of WeWork, and after you've checked out, you can just hang out there, get on with your work. There's a 24-hour barista, all that kind of stuff, okay? Now, if you've done a bit of research before you stay in a Moxie and you get the deal, you'll think it's brilliant. And I was talking to someone at Moxie Hotels, and they said, basically, everybody who comes to a Moxie hotel knowing what to expect thinks it's brilliant. But we have 10% of people who turn up expecting a Marriott and they get really, really pissed off. So it's nothing to do with who they are or what the product is, it's what they've been led to expect. So an awful lot of innovations can only happen if you manage expectation in advance. But when I say that marketing, not everything's done with an individual brand budget to serve the interests of an individual business. There is tons and tons of marketing out there which may be completely unintentional, but which has an enormous effect on consumer behavior. And one of the things that's always struck me as strange is because we've defined marketing as a department, we never go looking for things that are incredibly important marketing ideas which weren't deliberately instigated by a single brand or company effectively trying to market itself. For instance, I argue that the worldwide Prosecco industry should give a one-off payment of $10 million to whoever came up with this phrase. Right? What that actually means is breakfast for alcoholics. Right? If you think about it, okay, what it's actually saying is, why don't you turn up really early in the morning, have some breakfast foods, and get really pissed while you're doing it, okay? It doesn't really sound like that reputable an activity, does it? Big blackboard outside your bar, get pissed at breakfast, right? Not gonna work. Weirdly, you call it a bottomless brunch, and the entire thing is destigmatized. And so it strikes me that there are these huge examples everywhere. If we treat markets a bit like Charles Darwin treated the Galapagos Islands, go around and have a shufti and look for anomalies and peculiarities and see what you can learn from them. I argue that Uber was very largely a marketing success story, and my argument is what really made people like Uber. I'm sure when they come to write Harvard Business School, case studies, they'll go blah, 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 efficiencies, etc., gains to scale, da-da-da. I'm sure all those things are partly true. It was really a psychological success story, and I'll come to this a bit later, in the sense that it didn't really change the experience of riding in a taxi at all. Riding in an Uber is basically the same as riding in any other taxi. It didn't massively change necessarily the wait time for a taxi. What it transformed was the psychological experience of waiting. It wasn't the quantity of time you spent waiting, it was the quality of the time you were waiting. Humans absolutely hate uncertainty. We were just talking about this earlier. And not knowing when a taxi is going to appear or when it's going to turn up drives us practically insane. We don't even know the license plate of the taxi. We're not sure it's even on the way, okay? Suddenly, that little map, I know how long I'll have to wait for a taxi without having to actually ring up and book one. And then when I book the taxi, I can see where it is and when it's going to arrive. There's a huge difference between my taxi could be here anytime between 10 and 15 minutes and, oh, look, he's stuck at those traffic lights, I'll have another pint, okay? So it's a complete psychological transformation, which has, now, I always think what most businesses do is they look at the objective numerical measures of things, not the perceptual measures. So most businesses, because it's easy to measure and quantify these things and they fit in a spreadsheet and they aggregate and they're great for the purposes of reporting, most businesses massively overrate what you might call objective measures over subjective measures. For the same reason, most businesses, I would argue, overweight acquisition versus retention. For the simple reason that acquisition data is very quick to generate, whereas if you experiment with customer loyalty and customer retention, you're probably onto your next job before the actual figures emerge. So if one of the luckiest breaks I ever had in my life was meeting Nassim Taleb. I don't know if anybody's a fan of his work. He's written a book, Anti-Fragile, and the subtitle is The Hidden Asymmetries in Everyday Life. And there are massive, massive asymmetries all over the place. And one of the problems that business has is it deals with data as if it's objective, but most of the business data that businesses have access to is massively unrepresentative. So, if you think about it, why are salespeople sometimes paid six figures, but customer call center operatives never are? I've argued that in a just world, your very best call center people would earn a six-figure salary. Because if you're really good, okay, you can rescue 15 valuable customers. Okay, to justify that kind of money, you'd only have to save a few hundred of the best American Express card members every year, okay? Why do they not get paid six-figure salaries, whereas the sales force do? That's because the sales force can lay credit immediately and lay claim to all of the incremental revenue they bring in, whereas someone who rescues customers or creates a fantastic moment so that people become vastly more loyal than they were before the phone call occurred, you don't have the ability to actually quantify that either in the same way or at the same speed. So I would argue that one of the worst things that happen in business, and Roger L. Martin's very good on this, is we created this Harvard Business School idea, every business decision should be taken on data. But that only works if the data is representative. Other examples of marketing where effectively I would define marketing as the creation of value through the study of perception and subjective measures rather than the study of objective shit. I argue this is one of the greatest marketing case studies of all time. For those of you who don't know, the London Overground always existed. It was a series of railway lines branded with the British Rail logo, which was called Silverlink Metro. Now, a very peculiar facet of Londoners is they think if you see the British Rail logo, unless you live in southeast London, anybody who sees a rail logo goes, that's nothing to do with me, that's what you do if you want to go out of London, okay? And everybody who sees the London Transport logo goes, that's me, that's what I need to use, right? Now, the London Overground always existed. It was called Silverlink Metro. It was branded like a railway line. Genuinely, most Londoners had no idea that it existed. I had friends who lived about 100 yards from Clapham High Street. I said, where do the trains go from that station? And one of them said, I don't know. And the other one said, what station? Right? And that was purely the psychological way in which Londoners' brains work, which is they basically go trains leaving London, tube roundel, that's for getting around London. Okay? So now, in fairness, they did, when Transport for London took it over, they did spend about 200 million improving the rolling stock. They improved lighting, disabled access at stations, and I think they built a few miles of extra track to connect two bits together. Then they did the genius bit. They pretended it was a tube line. Okay? They branded it like a tube line, they called it the Overground, and they put it on the tube map. On the first day, usage went up, I think, by about a factor of 3. It now carries as many people as the Elizabeth line does. The Elizabeth line cost £20 billion. This cost 200 million and some pixels and some ink, okay? What they didn't do was change fundamentally what the line did. What they did is they fundamentally changed the way it was perceived. To use Byron Sharp language, they basically made it mentally available. That's all. And that's £20 billion worth of value, I would argue, created with psychology. But you can also use psychology to solve problems that seem completely intractable. And this is one of the problems when you deal with people who automatically look at things as if they're an either-or. They have a kind of oppositional mindset. They don't practice integrative thinking. A lot of problems to them look like a trade-off when they're really not. And this is one of my favorite kind of marketing psychology problem-solving ideas of all time. It's Winston Churchill and the Queen. It's 1953. They're hosting Churchill's back in Downing Street. The Queen's newly on the throne. They're hosting a dinner for dignitaries in Buckingham Palace. And in the middle of the meal, a footman comes up and says, we've got a bit of a problem. One of the very distinguished guests has nicked one of the, I think it was one of the salt shakers. Now, two choices. You take the hit or you create a diplomatic incident by accusing them of theft, right? Neither of those two outcomes is particularly attractive, is it? And so they were there having this dilemma because they date back to George III and they're solid gold and so on and so forth. And they didn't really know what to do. And Churchill just said, don't worry, I'll sort this out. He takes the matching pepper pot from the table and just tucks it in his breast pocket. Doesn't say anything else. He said, I've got this, don't worry, it's not a problem. After the meal, the person who'd stolen the salt shaker is standing on his, it's actually her own, okay? And Churchill just sidles up to her, pulls out the little pepper pot or salt shaker from his own pocket and says, I think we've both been spotted, we better put these back. Now, the sheer genius of that, okay, is what nobody spotted there was the problem you had to face was an emotional problem, okay? You could either take the hit and lose the pepper pot or the salt shaker, or you could find a way of getting the person to return the salt shaker in a way that did not humiliate them. Now, if you go up to them as the most powerful person in the room at the time and accuse them of theft, they are naturally going to be outraged, massively upset, lead to denial, get absolutely defensive about it. If you go up to them, now I don't think the person actually believed that Churchill was in the habit of heisting the tableware. But if you go up to them and pretend that you're a fellow offender, okay, the entire emotional nature of that conversation is totally different. And so they both almost sort of, I think, mischievously, with a kind of air of, mutual mischief, they sneak back to the table, pop the things back on the table, honour is served, pepper pot is returned. That's what I mean by the fact that you can, because the great thing about the laws of psychology is they're much, much fluffier than the laws of physics or the laws of economics. And so the downside of that is, obviously, it doesn't lend itself so well to calculation, but the upside is, whereas you can't basically change the laws of physics or cheat them, you can kind of cheat the laws of psychology. And if you want marketing described in a single slide, it's simply that. It's that brilliant American habit, which I don't understand why we've never adopted over here, of having a feels-like temperature. Because in Britain, we actually have a weather forecast with the objective temperature. Now, I'm a fat guy of Celtic ancestry, okay? And one thing I never fully understood is that I can wander around Phoenix, Arizona when it's 105 and I'm as happy as Larry, but if it gets to about 88 degrees in London, I basically stay at home because it's uninhabitable. And the reason for that is we're not going outside tomorrow. We don't need the weather forecast because we're going to do scientific experiments, okay? We don't need the exact physical temperature as a physicist would measure it, because the human body hasn't evolved to experience heat as a thermometer has. Basically, we feel uncomfortably hot when our body wants to tell us that your actual health or well-being might be at risk. And consequently, the human perception of heat, our internal mental thermometer, factors in any conditions in which our body's cooling system, which basically means sweat, might be compromised. So the feels-like temperature is a product of, obviously, the temperature itself, very heavily weighted by humidity, because in low humidity we sweat a lot and therefore we cool down really efficiently, and also a level of breeze, if there's a breeze. There's a fourth measure I think the Americans use, which is something to do with how hot it is, like 5 feet off the ground. So if there's heat coming off the ground, it disproportionately weights that up. I can't quite remember the details. By the way, it turns out that this feels-like temperature is much more important than we realize, because nearly all of the conversation around global warming is based not on a biological measure of temperature, but on a physicist's measure of temperature. Technically, it's the wet bulb temperature, which features in the cooling effect of evaporation, and the dry bulb temperature is just the temperature, okay? Now, the problem we have is that the threat of global warming isn't that it gets hot, it's that it gets hot and humid at the same time. And that's because quite a few organisms, including humans, if you put a healthy human, perfectly well hydrated, at a certain combination of heat and humidity, they're incapable of surviving. Doesn't have to be that hot. If it's that hot and that humid, you've got a problem. Now, humans can probably get away with it because of air conditioning. Large numbers of animal species, which rely on basically evaporation and sweat for cooling, they don't have air conditioning. They're going to die. And so it turns out that actually the global warming movement should have been using a biological measure of temperature. In other words, what sort of conditions are not conducive to survival, rather than the physicist's measure. And that's my point. You should optimize for perception rather than objective reality, because it's perception that determines behavior. And one of my examples here is we've spent literally hundreds of billions of dollars trying to solve the problem of range anxiety in electric cars by increasing range. Now, some of that's worthwhile. It's research into higher density batteries, this kind of thing, okay? But a lot of it, to be honest, is cars with batteries that are bigger than they need to be, that are heavier than they need to be, that are more expensive than they need to be, just so you can claim 320 miles of range. Now, don't get me wrong, in the United States, in Australia, those things aren't totally ridiculous, right? If you live in Idaho and your parents live 500 miles away, you are quite bothered by the range of your electric car. In countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, the UK, where the vast majority of journeys are under 100 miles, overwhelmingly under 100 miles, okay? Range anxiety, to be honest, is a bit of an irrational fear. We don't need batteries that are the same size as electric cars have in the United States, necessarily. And so I said, look, there are two ways to solve range anxiety. You can increase range, or you can reduce anxiety. Now, there are lots of ways you can reduce anxiety. One suggestion we had was you don't need your car battery indicator to say 87%, and then you go to the shops and it says 85%. Okay? You don't need, your petrol gauge never had that level of detail. Why are you making people worried by reminding them of every 1% of battery capacity they use? It should just say 80% plus, 70% plus, 60% plus. Maybe when you get down to 18%, you need individual percentages, because then you're getting a bit nervous. There is absolutely no need for battery car indicators to have that level of detail. It just weirds people out. You could have gone to Google Maps or Android Auto or Apple CarPlay and just said, can we just have a panel on the screen of everybody's GPS which says nearest available car charger, X miles, and most of that anxiety will go away. Now, my argument is, look, it's a lot cheaper to reduce anxiety than it is to increase range. And as a consequence, we've obsessed about increasing range, making cars heavier, more expensive. You wander around London, most of those cars only go about 9 miles on average, and yet they've got a 90 kilowatt hour battery, which is, unless you can plug it into the grid, is basically sitting there doing bugger all, where it could be doing something much more useful somewhere else. And so I don't know why this is going on, but fundamentally what you have to understand is that human perception governs behavior in many ways much more than objective reality does. This is a fascinating one, because how many of you thought 45 miles an hour? Come on, admit it. If you look at that problem, you think, okay, he's gone 15 miles an hour for a mile. In order to average 30 miles an hour for the 2 miles, he has to go at 45 miles an hour. And by the way, you're not terrible doing that, because Einstein, for about 15 seconds, made exactly the same mistake. He looked at this and thought, okay, 15 miles an hour for 1 mile. In fact, you've got to go infinitely fast. It's actually totally impossible. Because to average 30 miles an hour for the whole 2 mile trip, you'd have to effectively do the second mile in 0 seconds, because you've already used up your average in the first mile. How many people have seen this before? Has anybody seen me present this before? Nobody? Thank God for that. Okay. The reason I show this in every single presentation with monotonous tedium is partly because it illustrates my point, but it's also because, fundamentally, it might save somebody's life. I mean that in the room. On the inside, we're all familiar with that speedometer. We all know what a speedometer is. For whatever reason, and it's pure convention, the way that we've always denoted speed is distance per time, miles per hour, meters per second, whatever it may be. Okay, that's how we just define speed. These two Israeli behavioral scientists said, what happens if you show it the other way around? Very interesting question. And they invented a thing which is denoted by the blue digits around the outside, which they call a paceometer. And that isn't miles per hour, it's minutes per 10 miles. Now, objectively, 60 miles an hour and 10 minutes to go 10 miles are exactly the same speed, okay? There is no difference. I showed this to Nassim Taleb, and he said it's fascinating because it's mathematically trivial, but it's completely counterintuitive, right? What you will have started to notice is something which is completely non-apparent to you if you're simply using miles per hour or the conventional denotation of speed, which is if you accelerate from 0 miles an hour to 10 miles an hour, if you accelerate from 10 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour, for any 10-mile journey, you save 30 minutes. Accelerate 10 miles an hour more, now you only save 10 minutes. You've gone from 30 to 10. Accelerate from 30 to 40, now you only save 5 minutes. If you're already going at 70 miles an hour and you accelerate to 80, you're saving, for every 10 miles, you're saving about 63 seconds. So the reason I say it could save someone's life is that people come up to me and say, after you showed me that thing, it changed the way I drive. Broadly speaking, if you're going at 70 miles an hour and you're comfortable and you notice from your GPS or your sat-nav, oh gosh, I'm going to be 4 minutes late for that meeting, and you welly it up to 90, okay, unless you stay at 90 for about 40 miles, you're going to make fuck all difference to your arrival time. If anybody had seen a paceometer, no one would have made high speed 2 go that fast. Because as you get faster and faster, okay, your energy consumption goes up exponentially, your braking distance goes up exponentially, your risk of an accident goes up exponentially, the likelihood of a fatality in the instance of an accident goes up exponentially, the amount of time your journey takes is hitting an asymptote. It's basically hitting a ceiling. And by looking at the same information in a different way, what's really interesting is a completely different story emerges. And so I spend a lot of time talking about the 60 mile an hour, 70 mile an hour thing and saying, look, it's a really good idea avoiding traffic jams if you want to get there on time. But actually, whether you go at 65 or 80 on the motorway has very, very little effect on your time of arrival, unless you're literally driving for sort of 150 miles at those speeds. Then I started looking at the other end, and something really weird emerged, which genuinely I don't think, occurred to me ever before. I suddenly realized why the bicycle was the most important invention in many ways in the last 200 years. And that's because let's imagine you live 10 miles from your place of work, or you live 10 miles away from the factory where you work, or you live 10 miles away from your nearest market town. On foot, that return journey is going to take you about 4.5 hours. That's a pretty big chunk of the day. On a bicycle, it'll take you about, I guess, an hour and 20 minutes. Now, that is totally transformational in terms of time saving. The difference between walking and cycling is massive, okay? In the first 20 miles you ride on a bicycle, you'll probably save, therefore, something like 3.5 hours, 4 hours of your time, rather than walking. And then I just did a thought experiment because I was messing around in my own head. And I suddenly realized in 1979, let's say you decided to upgrade from a Boeing 747 to the Concorde to go from London to New York. Okay? By going on the Concorde at 2,400 miles an hour, a distance of about 5,000 or 6,000 miles, you saved less time by going on the Concorde relative to a Boeing 747 than your great-grandfather saved in the first 20 miles he rode a bicycle. Now, do you see what I'm saying? We've got exactly the same data here. It's objective physical data. But if you just present it in a slightly different way, the story it tells is completely different. By the way, there's a school of evolutionary biologists who believe that the invention of the bicycle completely changed human evolution and the nature of the human gene pool. because for the first time ever, people can be bothered to have sex with people who live 10 miles away. Okay, so it fundamentally changed the whole of dating culture. Because previously, you could be someone fantastic, but oh fucking hell, it's 3 hours walk, right? Right? Now I find this utterly fascinating because advertising does the same thing. It takes the same fact and it allows you to look at it differently. It's one of my favorite ad campaigns, the greatest ad campaign of all time. Avis is, now, when Bernbach ran this ad, people said, you're mad, you're emphasizing a negative. People know that Avis isn't as big as Hertz. Why on earth are you telling them this? Because not being big is a negative. We'll have fewer choice of cars, fewer outlets, etc. And he said, no, because if you look at it in a slightly different way, you come to a complete size no longer means capability. It means, anonymity, lack of personal service, resting on your laurels. You can take exactly the same thing and you can effectively frame it in multiple different ways. The question is, this doesn't cost very much. Why is it so hard to do? And I think the reason is that most people are shit at maths. No, actually, no, that is true, by the way. I mean, I did A-level maths and S-level maths. The problem I had was my brother was on the British Maths Olympiad team for 1980, I think 1979 or 1980. So I spent my whole childhood thinking I was really shit at maths. And then he realized that in any normal business setting, if you've got A-level maths, you're practically fucking John von Neumann, okay? Okay, it's a completely different order of general thing. But okay, this is what makes people who like things to look like a high school maths question find difficult about marketing. But this is true of almost every problem. Maths questions, bad maths, okay? Simple maths questions where you're given all the data you need. There's no extraneous data that you need to reject. And the data is just sufficient for you to arrive at a single right, demonstrably, provably right answer to the question. That is a completely artificial construct which is created for the purpose of maths exams. Unfortunately, people who are shit at maths carry that into their working lives and they go, something is only rational if we use all of the data we're given and we arrive at a single right answer. People are basically reconstructing business decisions to resemble GCSE maths questions. And here's why it's difficult, okay? There's no single right answer. In psychology, you can achieve the same effect through multiple means. Secondly, you're not really trying to be right, you're trying to be less wrong. Most business progress isn't let's come up with a perfect right answer. Most successful businesses have worked out how to be less wrong than their competitors. It's not cheating to change the question. That's one of the most important things, okay? Obviously, in an exam setting, you can't go into a history exam and they say, can you please write about the Peloponnesian War? And you go, I decided the Peloponnesian War was boring, so I'm going to write about, the advent of the railways, okay? Obviously, that wouldn't work. However, in a real-world business setting, rewriting the question is probably the best way to solve the problem. Because the fact that it's a problem could be one of two things. Either it is a problem and it's just really difficult to solve, or the reason it's been difficult to solve is because previously people have defined the problem in the wrong way. In other words, if you're trying to improve taxis, everybody would say we have to reduce waiting time. And the answer that Uber came up with is no, we have to make it feel less irritating to wait. Okay? Uber's solution, I think, is an answer to a much, much better question. And finally, the maths is different, okay? Fundamentally, Nassim Taleb said this to me, marketing is fat-tailed. We have a load of accountant nerds who live in a rather tragic existence where they think that every penny of cost has to be matched to a penny of revenue, right? It's that kind of proportionate even world. The world does not work like that, right? Real world. Okay, let's look at the reason marketing is fat-tailed. Do you know what fat-tailed distributions are? The important thing is it's one where the outliers can't be safely discounted. So height is thin-tailed, okay? If the tallest person in the world walked into this room, all of you would become about 3 inches taller on average, maybe 2 inches taller on average. On the other hand, if the richest person in the room walked in, you'd all be billionaires. So you see what I mean? Wealth is a fat-tailed distribution where a single outlier determines the whole average. height is a thin-tailed distribution where fundamentally no outlier has much effect on the actual overall average. Marketing is fat-tailed because real life is fat-tailed. If you look at your life, most of the important things that really happened to you that were really decisive in your life nearly didn't happen. If Keith Richards had caught a slightly later train from Dartford, right, and just I'll get the 12:15, there would have been no Rolling Stones, okay? Most of the really important stuff in life, there's a great book by Brian Klaas called Fluke. Has anybody read that? It's absolutely weird because it fundamentally changes the way you look at the world. You realize that World War I happened because a guy in Sarajevo took a wrong turn, okay, in a car. Okay, most things, actually very big things, emerge from very small things. There are butterfly effects, but it's massively fat-tailed. This idea which Ogilvy Australia had, okay, this is where marketing has a fundamental problem. Coke has now run this in about 140 countries, and they run it about every year or every other year. I would say it's made them in excess of $1 billion. Ogilvy Australia had the initial idea and implemented first in Australia. It keeps on running. It's a gift that keeps on giving. It's been going for years and years and years. Okay, I was in Norway about 6 months ago, and all the Coke cans had share a Coke with Thor or Sigrid or whatever. Okay, and here's the thing. Do you know how much Ogilvy Australia got paid for that? 350,000 Australian dollars. So not enough to buy a crap flat in a shitty part of Sydney. Now, my point about this is I then got pissed off and said this advertising agency business is total bullshit because you get held responsible for every penny of cost by the tragic procurement nerds and by the finance Stasi, okay? But you can only lay claim to a small proportion of the value you create. When you create an idea that's worth $1 billion, you get 350,000 Australian dollars. And it suddenly occurred to me, this isn't just an agency problem, this is a problem for marketers in general. That you are held accountable for every single penny of cost, but when you have those amazing breakthroughs, you don't get to claim much of the upside. For the next 10 years, who is getting the credit for those incremental sales? It's not marketing, is it? It's probably sales, or there's someone writing an article saying it's our superior supply chain distribution. This is, being a marketer is like being J.K. Rowling, but you only get the royalties on the first edition of the book. Okay? It's not a proportionate, it's not a symmetrical way in which the value of marketing, and I would argue that 50% of the value of marketing is what we do at the moment. 50% of it is continually looking for a really major breakthrough which has like order of magnitude effects. If I look at I spent about 12 years working on American Express, which is a brand I absolutely love, by the way, and it's kind of a bit of everything, American Express. It's a bit luxury goods, it's a bit member organization, it's a bit customer service. It's a fantastic brand to work on. And first of all, you might see that there's member since. They calculate that's been worth billions to them in the lifetime of the card. People are very, very reluctant to cancel because they think, well, if I cancel now and I rejoin, I'll look like a total noob, right? I'll be member. We know how important it is because occasionally they issue cards by mistake to people who are members since 95 and they've upgraded to the gold card or something and it says member since 26. And like 50% of people ring up and say, can you replace my card with the correct start date? Okay, that's been worth $1 billion to them. That was an idea given to them by Ogilvy. When I worked on American Express, it suddenly occurred to me that in those 10 years, 3 things we did were inordinately more valuable than everything else put together. One of them, which is a client idea, I don't steal all the credit for this, was the basic insight, okay, that we were spending a fortune telling people why they should have an American Express card, giving them loads and loads of rational reasons why it was really good. And this client had the insight, look, bear in mind this is the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. Everybody wants a fucking American Express card. The reason they're not applying is they're frightened of getting turned down. It was actually a bit of a dating problem. Do you know this, by the way? Has anybody read those books on the pickup artist community? I don't recommend them, by the way. I don't recommend you follow their advice. But it's quite interesting because there is a male dating strategy which only works in cities, right? Which is chat up everybody you fancy, Blatantly proposition everything you fancy. Obviously don't do that if you live in a village, because you get known as Pervy Dave and no one will speak to you. But in a city of 7 million people, you can get away with it day after day after day. And they discover that the reason 95% of men can't do it isn't because it doesn't work, it's because you can't take the rejection. It's fear of rejection is fundamentally what puts people off doing this. And so we managed to construct a thing which basically allowed us to say, all you need to do is sign your name to apply because we want you as a card member. And the second we used that magical formulation, it was effectively like, rather than having to chat somebody up, it was having American Express chat you up, okay? You know, get your coat, you've pulled, right? And that simple insight from a client who I think should have ended up retiring to Devon. I wonder what happened to him, but he should have ended up really rich for that insight. It was a fantastic game-changing insight which changed the whole nature of their business. And that's what I mean about the business being fat-tailed. And you know all my bee stuff, do you? That bees have a mixture of exploit and explore, which is you have bees that follow the waggle dance, they do what they're told, they go and collect pollen and nectar from known sources, but you also have a proportion of random bees that just piss off at random and do weird random shit, okay? And you need to get the balance right. It's called the explore-exploit trade-off. It occurs in algorithm design, it occurs in animal foraging. What we've done is by demanding everything we do pays off one activity at a time, we've overweighted exploit and we've underweighted explore. The maths is fundamentally different. Explore is fat-tailed maths, exploit is thin-tailed maths. And you can see search and breakthrough versus efficiency and growth, venture capital style risk-taking versus safe haven versus... So in every single thing, there's a different approach to the fat-tailed explore approach. What has happened is by subordinating marketing to sort of narrow short-termist financial metrics, we're overweighting exploit, and we're underweighting explore. One of the things I just say is every now and then do some daft things because you'd be amazed how often they work. But the other great thing about daft things is that your competitors won't do them because they're too serious. Now, okay, so our problem as marketers is we're really an explore business, we're R&D, we're marketing, surrounded by people who have an exploit mindset. We also have a problem. I'm going to be very quick about this. I'm slightly running out of time. Okay, I'm going to be very quick. Have you come across this concept of technoplasmosis? I coined the name, but it was Adel Borki, a brilliant Libyan marketing commentator who spotted the problem. Many of the metrics we're using are the same as everybody else's metrics, and they've very largely been fed to us by the platforms who want us to chase those metrics because they are the very metrics that make those platforms the most money. Now, the reason it's called technoplasmosis is there's a disease in cats called toxoplasmosis. There's a cat parasite that wants to infect another cat. The problem is that cats don't bite other cats very often. So in order for the parasite to spread from one cat to another cat, it needs an intermediate host. And that's usually a rat or mouse. So when a cat bites a rat or mouse and infects it with toxoplasmosis, the toxoplasmosis parasite affects the brain chemistry of the mouse, so the mouse is no longer frightened of cats. In fact, it finds male cat urine curiously attractive. And so what it does is it hacks the brain chemistry of the mouse to maximize the chance it'll get eaten by another cat, so the toxoplasmosis can go on to infect another organism. And I would argue that the big platforms have done the same with marketing metrics. They've set the marketing metrics to be whatever it is most to our interest. I mean, for example, there is no real measure in banner advertising of quality of surrounding content. Why is that? Because that's the last thing they want, because what they want to serve is high-paying ads against a totally shit backdrop. The last thing they want to do is admit that the surrounding content, which it does do, by the way, has a massive effect on the convincing nature of the advertisement and the likely conversion rate. Okay? So they've basically given you the metrics that suit their own end. It's a bit like I said to my wife, your metrics for sexual desirability should be heavily weighted towards obesity. Okay? It's basically a hack. Okay? Secondly, there's a bigger problem because we're all using the same metrics as everybody else. Anybody familiar with this guy? Mathematician, Wolfram Alpha is his thing. He said, I was in a meeting with him, and he said this really interesting thing. He said, the reason evolution works is because it has quite a loose fitness function. Evolution in nature. And when you think about it, it does. Okay, to be a living organism, you only have to meet basically two requirements. Find an environment in which you can stay alive long enough to reproduce. If you meet those criteria, it doesn't matter whether you're a patch of moss, whether you're a bee, whether you're a shark, whether you're a tree, whether you're a bacterium. If you can meet those criteria over any time scale that suits you, you get to stay in the game, okay? Loose fitness function. That's why you get extraordinary biodiversity. What we've done with metrics is we've imposed a tight fitness function. Everybody uses the same metrics, which means that every company becomes more similar in its behavior to every other company, which is the opposite of biodiversity. When you apply the same incentives to different businesses, they become more similar. On the top is the old world vulture, right? Now, on the bottom, new world, American vultures. Both of them look pretty fucking vulture-y, don't they? They've got no feathers around their head because they like to stick their neck into carrion. They're all optimized. They're slightly different in terms of the foot structure, da-da-da-da. But they're basically, the reason we call them vultures in both cases is because they really look like vultures. In fact, fascinatingly, they're almost entirely unrelated. The old world vulture is descended from hawks. The New World vulture is descended, would you believe it, from the crane. Okay? So they are so far apart in terms of their evolutionary shared ancestor that all you can basically say is they're both birds. Why do they look exactly the same? Because they've both been chosen to perform exactly the same function. You've imposed the same metrics of survival on both of them. This is what's happening when, if you want to be an individual, you've got to have some metrics of success that are uniquely yours. If you want to be a brand, I think every brand should have some metrics which they use to judge their performance, which are unique to them, which distinguish them from their competition. But instead, we're so addicted to comparison for the purpose of justifying our existence, and I'm going to have to skip all this because I'm running out of time. Fundamentally, there's this great book called Bottlenecks by Joseph Fishkin, who's a philosopher and lawyer at UCLA, who argues that we've got the whole of, basically, every single model of what is good consists of applying the same comparative measure to everybody and then judging what is best. Fishkin argues that in the wider context level, this is completely wrong, okay? Fishkin argues that we shouldn't optimize society for equality of opportunity. We should optimize society for plurality of opportunity. In other words, create a society where there are lots of different ways for different people to become successful in their own way, rather than saying, we'll send everybody to university and then the people who do get the best jobs. And he argues that every single person, including John Rawls, has basically effectively assumed a unitary structure for outcomes. I think this is fascinating because I think you can actually apply that to most digital online activity. If you're forever benchmarking and comparing yourself against other people, actually it's a loser's game. A bit of an unusual opinion. I think the Olympics are shit and they should be banned. Okay, the reason is you get to see the very few people who succeed. And even worse if you watch in America, because there's always this person, they had their mother died and then they had an injury, but they overcame adversity and they got a gold medal. What you don't see is the 17,000 people who completely failed to get there in the first place. So in terms of net payoff, the Olympics takes 50,000 people who try and achieve something and 3 of them succeed. Those odds are not good, okay? But because we only see the successes, you don't see the people who gave up their entire youth doing training and then got an injury, so their whole career was over. We think the Olympics is great. Sorry, I think the Olympics is crap. I think the only thing you should do is invent a sport of your own, like paddle, and then become good at it. Okay, don't benchmark yourself against other people. Go and create a new benchmark of your own and see where it takes you. Anyway, bit controversial. I don't think they'll be asking me to do the sports commentator job. What is it now? Oh, fucking hell, it's the 200 meters. What a waste of time that was for 5,000 people who failed even to make it to the contest. Interesting point, however, my niece's best friend at school is a very, very talented tennis player and was invited to join this elite academy. And her dad is like an actuary. And he looked at it statistically and said, don't do this. He said, okay, much as I'd love to have a daughter win Wimbledon, the odds of that are about 1 in 25,000. The odds that you give up the whole of your youth to this academy and then end up getting injured, okay, or it never comes to anything, those odds are about 50 to 60%. Now, bear in mind, if you're the world's 100th best tennis player, you're a fucking good tennis player, but you're living out of your car. It's only the top 10 people who make any money, right? Now, this becomes worse because I would argue if you really enjoy the sport, do it for its own sake. That's fine. If you have a massive innate talent like Usain Bolt or Tiger Woods, do it because you find it easy. If you're one of those incredibly rare people, it's probably worth doing, okay? But it's not even as good as it was 30 years ago. When John McEnroe started playing on the seniors tour, the other young tennis players said to him, so John, when you were winning Wimbledon and all that stuff, what did you do to keep fit? And John McEnroe said, well, I played tennis. He said, yeah, but obviously you played tennis, but what else do you do? Weights? Do you do now Pilates? I don't know what these people do. Spin classes, right? He said, no, I just played tennis. And when I got sick of playing tennis, I just stopped playing tennis. And they looked at him as if he was completely insane, because you cannot play tennis at the top level now unless you devote your entire life. Now, the 1972 Brazil team, okay, or 1974 Brazil team, they came off the pitch at half time. They lit cigarettes, right? You could be Paul Gascoigne, you could be Puskás, you could play football at the top level and be a bit of a lardass if you had enough talent, okay? You can't do that anymore. So maybe it's not worth trying. I'm just saying, I know it's a really depressing statistical take on organised sport. The only exception is golf, by the way, which is so rich, you can make a reasonable amount of money being quite a good golfer, because it's so rich. Everything else, total winner takes all. Anyway, okay, worrying fact, I'll be very quick here. Big businesses suffer this toxoplasmosis, technoplasmosis, and metrical benchmarking disease much more because they're incapable of being eccentric, because in a large publicly run business, everything you do has to be justifiable logically in advance, which completely limits the number of things you can do, which also makes you very easy to compete with. Okay? Family-run businesses, founder-led businesses, nearly all the good businesses now, if you look at the UK, are either family-owned or they're founder-run. Okay, there are a few good PLCs, not very many. These are the 5 winners of the 2024 Advertising Effectiveness Awards. 4 of them are family-owned. McCain, Specsavers, Yorkshire Tea, Laithwaites. Guinness is kind of run like a family-owned business. I would argue that actually large publicly run companies which are entirely enthralled to quarterly reporting and where the marketing people are eternally bossed around by the chief financial officer, I think they're incapable of building brands anymore. I think it's a waste of time. Most really interesting businesses, I think you find out they're either founder-run, Octopus Energy, Enterprise, Dyson, Jaguar Land Rover, JCB, okay? All the really interesting businesses that actually do shit are actually privately owned, family-run, or they've got a founder like Greg Jackson at Octopus, who's really interesting. If anybody's wondering what the hell the picture on the left is, it's T-Bay Services. Anybody stayed there? Gloucester Services? It's like an order of magnitude better than any other service station. Why? Because it's a family, a local family that founded it, not some tedious corporation or a bunch of wankers from private equity who'll basically fuck the whole thing up in 5 years anyway, okay? I mean, this is literally, it's a kind of Soviet-style capitalism we're living in, where your financial metrics, which you use to justify your own existence, are the primary product, not serving the customer. Okay, it's total bullshit. Anyway, I've got to stop. Anybody been Buc-ee's? If you're in Texas, go there. Disneyland meets a gas station. Once again, family-owned. AO, John Roberts, they give away bears. You could never do that. Okay, imagine if you tried to do that within your public limited company. Can you give me a business case as to what the ROI will be on giving a bear to a child, okay? And then they'll go, how can you prove that a bear is more successful than another animal? For example, a sloth or an aardvark, okay? It's impossible just to have a nice idea in a large organization because the self-justification nerds basically have a right of veto over everything, okay? And we end up working to their metrics, their timescales. I'm going to skip all this because you might have heard it before. 2 tips. One thing that's massively underrated and underused in the digital world is quality of writing. Amazon is a copywriting fucking disaster, okay? You go to the product, you think, I quite like this. Ooh, it's got USB-C, right? Basically, that's, if I see anything with USB-C on, I have to buy it. It's a bit tragic, but there you go. My real terror is they bring out USB-D, in which case I'll be bankrupt because I'll have to replace every single thing I own. Anyway, sorry about that. Quality copywriting is totally underrated in the digital space. I've seen an example where in an online retailer, simply improving the quality of the body copy describing the product literally improves things by, I think the conversion rate went up by like 40%. Okay, because someone bothered to write a nice emotional description rather than just specifications, 205 millimeters by so-and-so, okay, right? Quality writing is totally, totally underrated. AI now provides you with I think, an opportunity to, to start with something pretty good and then use a human to make it much better. But my final tip is, go out and go back to the business and say, okay, we've got all these metrics which we use to compare ourselves with everybody else. Some of them have probably been imposed on us by Google. Let's have a few metrics of our own. And there's a guy who runs this little transport service in Texas, and he said, well, I'm measured on this and this and this, which is more my competitors, but it's a weird little electric vehicle that only sits 6 people in it, it sort of waddles around the place in a strange way. Should I have another metric? And I just go, okay, number of times the passengers laugh while they're on board. Because they've got a little snicker that the driver has, and just click the clicker every time someone laughs. Because that's what makes you different from a bus, right? You pursue, in other words, that stops you becoming yet another vulture by following exactly the same criteria as everybody else. What we're doing is we're massively reducing biodiversity in the workspace because everybody's pursuing the same metrics to impress exactly the same investors who have exactly the same, or rather, yeah, it's not actually the investors or the owners, it's actually the intermediaries who have exactly the same objectives as each other. And what it's doing is creating a bit like the Olympics, it's hyper competition. What we should be doing is creating new games rather than competing at the existing ones. And then my final little tip, as I said, rather than trying to change the world, change how people see the world, because when they see the world differently, they behave differently, which then changes the world. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.